As Olive grew to understand the scope of her task, she began to see how to go about it. While working on her MA, she also produced a book, Indian Arts in Canada, with her former protege, Tom Hill. From then on, art would be a resource she would call on as she wove together an interdisciplinary approach to the study of history.
She realized that you couldn't take a narrow historical approach. You had to write First Nations history, you had to be multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. She began to look into art. Physical remains, costumes of First Nations people, the art that First Nations people had left. She began to look into anthropology and bring that into the study of history. So she began to take this multidisciplinary approach as well as the documentation which she found, government documents, for example, Indian agents who had been on reserves, their memoirs or letters in the archives.
Olive next moved on to the doctoral stage, the highest level of academic qualification. But Native history had never been the subject of a Canadian doctoral dissertation. There was no specialist in Canada who could direct and adjudicate such a thesis. But that didn't stop Olive Dickinson. She cleared a path through it all, gathering Native oral histories and combining them with the original texts of the colonizers in the archives of England, Spain, and France. These accounts were abundant in their descriptions of Aboriginal societies, the early contact relationships, and the original jurisprudence which laid down the legal framework of how Aboriginal people would be overtaken and governed. No previous historian had sought out these documents, but the reporter Olive did, learning to read French and Spanish in the process. She published breakthrough histories that have become Canadian studies textbooks.
There was a lot more material available than was generally believed. Now you can argue that this was through European eyes, and most of it is, but a lot of it was very sympathetic to the Indians, and with the help of anthropology and the other sciences, you can make some very well-informed guesses as to what the situation actually was.
In the 1670s, when the French wanted to proclaim the sovereignty of the King of France over these territories, Jesuit interpreters did the translating and the interpreting. And they had a great big powwow with many native tribes, and they all sang and swore, "Long live the King," and French flags were unfurled and crosses were planted and everything. The French were convinced that according to the law of nations and according to international law and so forth, they had just been establishing their sovereignty and the native people had accepted it. The native people understood that they were getting a very powerful ally who was going to defend them.
Bonjour.
The idea of absolute ownership, individual ownership, was just totally absent in any of the Indian societies. That was strictly a European concept.
The explorers were trying to find passage through the mountains to the Pacific Ocean, and the pagans found them. They were starving, they were freezing. So the pagans brought them in and helped them survive that winter, showed them how to live off the land, what kind of animals to eat, what kind of plants for medicine, kept them warm, helped them on clothing and how to build shelter.
The importance of maps. The Indians drew their maps in terms of days' travel and how long it took to get to a place. And at the time of the year, you can expect the ice to form. And it was on the basis of those maps that the Europeans finally penetrated the country and reached the Pacific Ocean.
Essentially, it's a cooperative relationship because the Aboriginals are now able to procure items that are going to make their lives a little less time-consuming. The natives' knowledge of the land, the canoe routes and where to go, and also their abilities as guides and interpreters. All of those help to create a mutually beneficial relationship.
The native qualities of hospitality and generosity were values that were prized. The native medicines, the herbs, the ointments, and so forth, came to be appreciated by the French doctors. They wrote back to France about these medications that they were learning about.
The Indians had well-functioning societies, that their societies functioned. The fact that societies functioned is proven by the fact that the Indians were there when the Europeans arrived.
Olive Dickinson decided that she was going to put First Nations people front and center as an integral part of the history of Canada. So she began to put this together, and she presented this case to the authorities at the University of Ottawa, who finally, with the help of her supervisor, Cornelius Janin, made certain that she was able to do a PhD looking at First Nations people in Canada. But it was a battle, and she could have easily given up. But when Olive was determined to do something, she didn't make a big fuss about it. She just did a lot of research, brought the facts together, and then presented her findings, and they couldn't say no to her.
Her doctoral thesis became her first best-selling textbook, The Myth of the Savage, published in 1984.
The first occupants of the land are the natural owners of that land. It's very clearly, unequivocally included in Justinian's Code, which was compiled in the 6th century and was the functioning international principles of Europe. It was a principle in Roman law. In fact, the Romans thought it was so obvious that they didn't, if you could prove that you were a first owner, that ended the argument, if you were a first inhabitant of a land. So how did they get around it? How did the Europeans get around that? Human in form only. You see that expression in some of the early writings, that they were human in form only, and therefore didn't have the same rights as real humans, which the Europeans were. So the first official modification you get was that in 1537, the Pope issued a bull, Sublimis Deus, in which he said that the Indians were human beings and they had full right to their freedom and to their property as any other human being. But in spite of that proclamation, general politics of the day didn't accord the Indians the full rights, considered them to be subhuman, and very quickly the Indians got classed as savages. This set a pattern, and once you get a pattern established, it's God's own job to get it changed. And so the idea of Indians, say for instance, being savages and uncivilized pervaded right until the present day.